In the grim darkness of the far future, they tell you the Imperial Guard has it rough, dying in trenches for the Emperor's glory, facing Xeno's horrors across distant worlds. But let me tell you something about real suffering. Try waking up every morning knowing that today might be the day your neighbor sells you to organ runners for a week's worth of corpse starch. Try living where the only law comes from the barrel of a stub gun, and the closest thing to hope is finding enough scrap metal to buy another day of breathing recycled air that's been filtered through 10,000 years of industrial waste. Welcome to the Underhive, where heroes don't get medals, they get unmarked graves in the sump pools. If you think you can handle the truth about humanity's lowest depths, smash that subscribe button, because the Emperor's light barely reaches down here and we're about to descend into hell itself. Jex Corin had been alive for 19 years, which made him practically ancient by Underhive standards. Most gangers were dead, crippled, or insane by 16, but Jex had three things going for him: quick reflexes, quicker wit, and an almost supernatural ability to sense when someone was about to put a knife in his back. This particular morning started like every other in Hive Tertius's Rust Quarter, with the stench of death and the sound of someone getting the living hell beaten out of them. Jex cracked open one eye from his sleeping spot wedged between two massive coolant pipes, immediately cataloging the sounds echoing through the Hab tunnel. Metal-soled boots on rusted grating, the wet slap of fists on flesh, a woman's voice pleading in broken low Gothic mixed with Underhive cant, standard Crimson Skull's shakedown by the sound of it. He rolled his shoulders, feeling the familiar weight of his stub pistol in its shoulder holster, a relic from his dead father's gang-fighting days, maintained with religious devotion because down here your weapon was your life. The grip was worn smooth from decades of desperate hands, the barrel slightly pitted but still true. Jex had test-fired it every week for 3 years, and it had never failed him. The Hab tunnel stretched in both directions, a cramped artery of corroded metal and jury-rigged power conduits that had been someone's attempt at civilization about 50 years ago. Now it housed 20 dozen gangers, scavengers, and other human refuse who couldn't afford even the squalor of a proper Hab block. Water dripped constantly from overhead pipes, creating rust-colored puddles that reflected the sickly yellow glow of dying lumens. 3 bodies lay scattered along the tunnel floor, yesterday's casualties. Old Henrik had finally succumbed to whatever lung rot had been eating him from the inside. The Voss twins had killed each other in a knife fight over a can of protein paste, which was about as stupid a way to die as any Jex had witnessed. Their blood had pooled together in death, mixing with the perpetual dampness that seeped up from the lower levels. Nobody bothered moving corpses anymore. The tunnel dwellers had learned to simply step around them until the smell got bad enough, then they'd drag the bodies to the nearest sump grate and let the Underhive's digestive system take care of the rest. It was practical, if not particularly dignified, but dignity was a luxury they couldn't afford. The beating sounds were getting closer now, accompanied by the distinctive whir of servo skulls that the Crimson Skulls used for reconnaissance. I could hear Kayla Vex's voice barking orders. The gang lieutenant was making her morning rounds, collecting protection money from anyone foolish enough to have anything worth taking. The woman's pleading had stopped, replaced with the kind of silence that usually meant someone had just learned what happened to people who couldn't pay their debts. Jex checked his chronometer, a battered Imperial Guard surplus piece that still kept accurate time despite being held together with wire and determination. 0647 Tertius Standard, right on schedule. The Crimson Skulls ran their territory like clockwork, which was both predictable and dangerous. Predictable because you knew when to avoid them, dangerous because they never deviated from their routine, which meant they were professional enough to be truly lethal. He counted his assets, 43 throne jelk in mixed currency, most of it debased local scrip that wouldn't be worth anything 3 levels up, his father's stub gun with 7 rounds of ammunition, a combat knife with a chipped but serviceable edge, a data slate containing scavenging maps of the deep tunnels that he'd compiled over 2 years of risking his life in the Underhive's forgotten places, and most importantly, a reputation for being competent enough to trust, but smart enough not to cross.
The servo skulls arrived first, their crimson-painted carapaces gleaming dully in the tunnel's failing light. Jex pressed himself deeper into the shadows between the coolant pipes, watching as the mechanical constructs swept the area with auspex sensors and pict recorders. The Crimson Skulls had salvaged these from an abandoned Adeptus Mechanicus outpost 3 years ago, and they'd been using them to maintain iron control over their territory ever since. Kayla Vex followed 30 seconds later, flanked by 4 gangers in the Skull's signature red leather and bone decorations. She was a tall, lean woman who'd survived 12 years in the Underhive through a combination of brutal cunning and absolute ruthlessness. Her left arm had been replaced with a crude mechanical prosthetic after a tunnel collapse, but she'd learned to use it as a weapon. The servo motors were strong enough to crush a man's windpipe. "Morning collection, tunnel rats," Kayla announced, her voice carrying the flat authority of someone who'd killed enough people to stop counting. "You all know the deal. Protection costs 20 throne per week, payable in advance." The surviving tunnel dwellers emerged from their hiding spots with the resigned shuffle of people who'd accepted their place in the food chain. Marta Kess, a former factory worker who'd been exiled to the Underhive for union organizing. Twin brothers named Yorick and Pole, who ran a small still producing rotgut alcohol. A half-dozen others whose names Jex had never bothered to learn because they probably wouldn't live long enough for it to matter. One by one, they placed crumpled bills and handfuls of coins into the collection bag that Kayla's lieutenant held open. The smart ones paid quickly and kept their eyes down. The desperate ones tried to negotiate, which never ended well. Senna Warwick was desperate. She was maybe 17, originally from the Middle Hives until her family's debts caught up with them. 6 months in the tunnels had left her gaunt and hollow-eyed, but she still carried herself like someone who remembered what it felt like to have hope. That was going to get her killed. I don't have it this week," Senna whispered when Kayla stopped in front of her. "My scavenging run came up empty, and the water recycler I was going to sell got contaminated by—" Kayla's mechanical fist connected with Senna's solar plexus, dropping the girl to her knees. The sound echoed through the tunnel like a gunshot, and several of the other dwellers flinched instinctually. 20 throne, Warwick, same as everyone else. "Please, I just need another week. I know where there's a cache of Archaeotech components 3 levels down. If you could just—" The second punch caught Senna in the face, breaking her nose with an audible crack. Blood streamed down her chin as she collapsed onto the rusted grating. "You know what I think?" Kayla crouched down, speaking in the conversational tone that every Underhiver learned to fear. "I think you've been holding out on us, living rent-free in our territory, breathing our air, drinking our recycled water. That's theft, by my reckoning." Jex felt his jaw tighten. He'd seen this play out before. Kayla would beat Senna to death as an example, then use her corpse to reinforce the point that the Crimson Skull's protection wasn't optional. It was efficient crown control. But it also meant losing someone who might actually be useful if she survived long enough to learn the rules. More importantly, Senna had mentioned Archaeotech. In the Underhive, that word was like saying treasure and death trap in the same breath. Archaeotech components could be worth thousands of throne gelt to the right buyer, but they were usually guarded by automated defense systems that had been killing scavengers for 10 millennia. "String her up," Kayla ordered, standing back up.
Let her hang for 3 days, then dump what's left in the sump pools. 2 of her gangers moved forward with practiced efficiency, producing a length of razor wire that they began fashioning into a noose. Senna tried to crawl away, leaving a trail of blood on the metal grating. Jex made his decision. "Wait!" He stepped out from between the coolant pipes, hands visible but ready to move. "I'll cover her debt." Kayla turned slowly, her augmetic eye clicking as it focused on him. "Well, well, Jex Corin joins the conversation. Feeling charitable today?" "Feeling practical." Jex reached into his jacket and pulled out his handful of crumpled bills. 20 thrown for Warwick, plus 20 for my own protection, but I want something in return. You're not in a position to negotiate, tunnel rat. Aren't I? Jex gestured towards Senna, who was still bleeding on the ground. She mentioned archaeotech components. That's worth more than 40 thrown if it's legitimate. You kill her now, that information dies with her. Kayla's organic eye narrowed. The Crimson Skulls had survived this long by being pragmatic above all else, and she was calculating whether the potential profit outweighed the precedent of letting someone off easy. Partnership deal. We recover the components, split the proceeds 3 ways. The Skulls get their cut, Warwick gets enough to pay her debts for the next 6 months, and I get enough to make this worth my time. And if there are no components, if she's lying, then you can string us both up and make an even better example.
The deep tunnels beneath Hive Tertius were older than the Imperium itself. They stretched down through layers of forgotten history, archaeotech data conduits from the dark age of technology, collapsed mining shafts from the first human settlements, and stranger things that predated humanity's arrival on this world entirely. The air grew thicker with each level descended, heavy with metallic dust and the chemical tang of ancient preservatives that had been slowly breaking down for millennia. Jex led the way with a portable lumen strapped to his chest, its weak beam barely penetrating the absolute darkness ahead. Behind him, Senna followed with her own light, still nursing her broken nose, but moving with the determined gait of someone who knew this was her only chance at survival. Kayla had given them 48 hours to produce results, generous by Skull's standards, but still a death sentence if they came back empty-handed. "The access shaft should be just ahead," Senna whispered, consulting a hand-drawn map that looked like it had been copied from a dozen other maps over the years. "My contact said the cache was hidden behind a maintenance panel marked with Mechanicus symbols." "Your contact have a name?" Jex asked, stepping carefully around a section of flooring that looked suspiciously unstable. "Had. Grex Malarar got himself killed by a tunnel worm last month, but he sold me the location right before he went down there." She paused, then added, "He was we were close." That explained the desperation. Grief made people stupid, and stupid people got dead fast in the Underhive. But it also made them reckless enough to venture into places that more sensible scavengers avoided, which is how the best finds were made. They had been descending for 3 hours, following maintenance shafts and service tunnels that grew progressively ancient as they went deeper. The walls had changed from industrial plasteel to stone blocks carved with symbols that hurt to look at directly. The temperature had dropped 15 degrees, and their breath was beginning to fog in the stale air. There, Senna pointed, ahead to where their lights revealed a massive circular chamber carved from solid rock. "That's it. Grex said the Mechanicus cache was hidden behind a maintenance panel marked with Mechanicus symbols." The chamber was easily 100 meters across, its ceiling lost in shadows above their heads. Banks of dormant machinery lined the walls, cogitator arrays, power distribution nodes, and stranger devices whose functions had been lost to time. Everything was covered in a fine layer of metallic dust that sparkled in their lights like ground diamonds. Jex's tactical instincts were screaming warnings.
The chamber was too perfect, too preserved. In his experience, places that looked this untouched usually had very good reasons for remaining that way. "Movement sensors," he muttered, pointing to barely visible devices mounted at regular intervals around the chamber's perimeter. "Still active by the look of the power indicators." "Greg said the defenses were disabled," Senna protested. "He made it in and out twice before he got killed by something he wasn't expecting." Jex knelt beside the chamber's entrance, examining the threshold with professional care. "Look at this." The stone floor was scored with deep gouges, as if something large and sharp had been dragged across it repeatedly. The marks were fresh, recent enough that they hadn't accumulated the same layer of dust as everything else. "Servo skull patrol routes," Jex identified, tracing the patterns with his finger. "But these aren't Imperial designs. Look at the scoring depth. Whatever made these had cutting tools, not just recording equipment." Senna's face went pale in the lumen light. "Grex never mentioned servo skulls." "Because Grex was an idiot who got lucky twice and assumed that made him immortal. But we're here now, and Kayla's expecting results." They moved into the chamber with the careful precision of people who knew they were probably walking into a trap. Jex took point, following the wall to avoid the open center where the movement sensors would have the best coverage. Senna stayed close behind, her breathing shallow and rapid. The Mechanicus cache was exactly where her map indicated, a section of wall marked with the gear and skull symbol of the Adeptus Mechanicus. The access panel was ornate even by tech priest standards, decorated with scroll work and binary cant that proclaimed the glory of the Omnissiah in a dozen different dialects. "Can you read any of this?" Senna asked, running her fingers over the inscriptions. Enough. Jex had learned basic Mechanicus cant during his father's time with a gang that specialized in tech heresy. Warning about unauthorized access, standard security protocols, something about sacred guardians of the blessed knowledge. The panel responded to pressure on a specific sequence of symbols, sliding aside with a whisper of perfectly maintained servos. Behind it lay a storage compartment filled with components that made Jex's breath catch in his throat. Genuine standard template construct data wafers, power cells that still showed full charges after millennia, and what looked like a complete Auspex array small enough to be portable. "Emperor's blood," Senna whispered. "That's worth more than most gangers see in their entire lives." Jex was already filling his salvage bag with the most valuable pieces, working with practiced efficiency. But something was nagging at him. The chamber was too quiet, the air too still. In his experience, places with this much valuable tech didn't stay unguarded for long. That's when he heard the whir of activation servos echoing from somewhere above their heads. "Senna, we need to move, now!" The first servo skull descended from the shadows like a crimson angel of death, its cutting torch already ignited and burning with blue-white intensity. Unlike Imperial models, this one was built for killing rather than recording. Reinforced carapace, enhanced mobility systems, and weaponry that could slice through power armor. Two more emerged from concealed alcoves in the walls, their optical sensors bathing the chamber in sweeping red light. Jex grabbed Senna's arm and pulled her toward the nearest cover as laser beams began crisscrossing the air where they'd been standing. "So much for disabled defenses," Senna gasped, pressing herself against a bank of ancient cogitators. "Your boyfriend lied, or he disabled the wrong systems." Jex returned fire with his stub gun, the solid rounds sparking off reinforced carapaces but failing to penetrate. "Either way, we're in it now." The servo skulls moved with mechanical precision, herding Jex and Senna deeper into the chamber like predators driving prey into a kill zone.
Their tetting torches left molten scars across the ancient stonework, and the acrid smell of burning metal filled the air. Jex's stub gun was proving useless against their armored carapaces. He needed something with more punch. "The power distribution node," he shouted over the whine of lasfire, pointing to a massive junction box 20 meters away. "If we can overload it, the feedback might fry their control circuits." Senna nodded, clutching a plasma conduit she'd torn from one of the cogitator banks. The girl had good instincts. The conduit could carry enough charge to stop a man's heart if used properly. "Cover me!" They broke from cover simultaneously, Jex laying down suppressing fire while Senna sprinted toward the power node. One of the servo skulls tracked her movement, its cutting torch carving a line of destruction across the chamber floor. She dove the last few meters, sliding behind the node as superheated plasma scorched the air where she'd been running. Jex's ammunition counter hit 0 as the chamber's ancient lighting system flickered and died. Emergency lumens activated with dull red light, casting everything in the color of dried blood. In the sudden dimness, the servo skull's optical sensors blazed like tiny stars, their targeting systems adapting to the changed conditions. The explosion that followed lit the chamber like a miniature sun. Senna had jammed the plasma conduit directly into the power node's primary coupling, creating a feedback loop that sent 10,000 years worth of stored energy cascading through systems that had never been designed to handle such overload. Sparks erupted from every piece of machinery in the chamber, and 2 of the servo skulls simply dropped from the air as their control circuits fried. The third one, however, had been built to Imperial military specifications rather than civilian maintenance standards. It weathered the electromagnetic pulse and came hunting for them with the single-minded determination of a machine that knew only how to kill. "This way!" Jex grabbed Senna's arm and hauled her toward a service tunnel he'd spotted during their initial survey. The tunnel was barely wide enough for a human body, carved from living rock and disappearing into darkness. Behind them, the surviving servo skull's cutting torch carved through the stone wall they'd been hiding behind moments before. They crawled through absolute darkness, guided only by the tunnel walls and the increasingly distant sound of destruction behind them. Jex's tactical vest caught on rough stone, and Senna's breathing was harsh with exhaustion and terror, but they kept moving because stopping meant dying. The tunnel opened into another chamber, smaller than the first, but filled with the familiar sounds of human habitation. Voices echoing off stone walls, the clatter of equipment being moved, and underneath it all the low chanting that Jex's blood run cold. "That's not low Gothic," Senna whispered, pressing her face to a crack in the tunnel wall. "What language is that?" Jex already knew, but saying it out loud would make it real. Instead, he motioned for silence and crawled forward to get a better view of what they'd stumbled into. The chamber below was a mirror image of the one they'd just escaped, but this one had been converted into something that would have horrified even the most jaded inquisitor. Crude altars made from scavenged metal were arranged in ritual patterns, their surfaces stained with substances that definitely weren't oil. Dozens of gangers from at least 3 different factions knelt in concentric circles, their voices raised in praise to powers that should never be named. At the center of it all stood Kayla Vex. But it wasn't the Kayla they'd left behind in the tunnels. This version wore robes decorated with symbols that seemed to writhe and shift when viewed directly. Her mechanical arm had been modified with additional attachments, blades, injection ports, and stranger things that pulsed with their own inner light. When she turned to address the gathered cultists, Jex could see that her augmetic eye had been replaced with something that definitely wasn't Imperial technology. The time of revelation approaches. Soon the barriers between realms will weaken, and our patrons will reward the faithful with gifts beyond imagining. One of the kneeling gangers, Jex recognized him as Davin Krosk from the Iron Jackals, a rival gang that should have been at war with the Crimson Skulls, raised his head in supplication. "When will the blessed transformation begin, Apostle?"
when the final component is retrieved from the sacred archives above. Our faithful scavengers should be returning soon with the last piece we need to complete the summoning array. Senna's sharp intake of breath was barely audible, but in the sudden silence that followed Kayla's words, it might as well have been a scream. The cultists' chanting stopped, and dozens of eyes turned toward their hiding spot with predatory interest. "Well, well," Kayla's voice drifted up from the chamber below, now carrying an amused tone that was somehow worse than her earlier threats. "It seems our tunnel rats have been more successful than expected. Please, join us. We have so much to discuss." The servo skull that had been hunting them emerged from the tunnel behind them, its cutting torch dark, but its optical sensor blazing with malevolent intelligence. Jex realized with sick certainty that it hadn't been trying to kill them. It had been hurting them, driving them down here like prey animals being guided into a slaughter pen. Still with us in the darkness? Hit that like button if this revelation chills your soul to the bone. "Move," Jex hissed, but there was nowhere to go. Below them waited a chamber full of chaos cultists, behind them was a killing machine, and somewhere in the depths of his salvage bag, wrapped in protective cloth, were the components that would complete whatever unholy ritual Kayla had planned. The Underhive had always been hell. Now Jex was starting to understand that it was about to be something infinitely worse.
The descent into the ritual chamber felt like falling into the maw of some ancient predator. Cultists lined their path, faces painted with symbols that seemed to move in peripheral vision, their eyes reflecting an inner light that had nothing to do with the flickering torches mounted on crude sconces. Jex counted at least 40 gangers from different factions: Crimson Skulls, Iron Jackals, Rust Eaters, even some sump dwellers who rarely ventured this far from the lowest levels. "You're wondering how long this has been going on," Kayla said, her modified voice carrying perfectly in the stone chamber. She stood beside the central altar, one hand resting on what looked like a communication array, built from scavenged Vox equipment and components that definitely weren't Imperial manufacture. "The answer is, longer than you've been alive, tunnel rat." Senna stumbled beside him, her face pale with shock and recognition. "The territorial wars," she whispered. "They weren't really fighting each other, were they?" "Very good." Kayla's organic eye fixed on the girl with something that might have been approval. "For 3 years, we've been orchestrating conflicts to drive scavengers deeper into the Underhive, closer to the old places where certain barriers are thinner. Every gang war, every territorial dispute, every protection racket, all of it designed to map the ancient tunnels and locate the components we needed." The altar's surface was covered with archaeotech devices, most of them connected by cables that pulsed with eldritch energy. Jex recognized pieces of the communication array he'd seen in the upper chamber, but they'd been modified with additions that made his eyes water to look at directly. Symbols carved into the stone floor formed intricate patterns that seemed to extend beyond the physical dimensions of the chamber itself. The Crimson Skulls were never really a gang, Jex realized, his tactical mind finally putting together the implications. "You've been recruiting from the other factions, bringing them into... what? A cult?" "A family," Kayla corrected, her mechanical fingers dancing across the altar's control surfaces with practiced ease. "The ruinous powers offer what the Imperium never could: genuine brotherhood, shared purpose, and rewards for loyalty that extend beyond this miserable existence." One of the cultists stepped forward. Jex recognized him as Marcus Vaughn, formerly of the Iron Jackals, now wearing the mixed colors of all 4 gangs in a patchwork that should have been impossible. His left arm had been replaced with something that looked organic, but moved wrong, and when he spoke, his voice carried harmonics that hurt to hear. "Show them the gifts, Apostle. Show them what awaits the faithful." Kayla smiled, and Jex immediately wished she hadn't.
Her teeth had been filed to points and inlaid with metal that glowed with its own inner light. Marcus volunteered for the first transformation 3 months ago. The blessing he received allows him to survive in environments that would kill normal humans. Airless tunnels, toxic gas pockets, even brief exposure to hard vacuum. At what cost? Senna demanded, finding her voice despite the horror surrounding them. Cost? Marcus laughed, the sound echoing strangely in the chamber. There is no cost, only evolution. I can see in perfect darkness, my strength has tripled, and I no longer feel pain or fear. What did your precious Emperor ever offer that could compare? Jex's hand moved instinctively toward his stub gun, but stopped when he realized it was empty. Even if he'd had ammunition, 40 cultists and an enclosed space were odds that even his father's legendary luck couldn't have overcome. But there was something else bothering him, something about the timing that didn't add up. You said you needed components from the upper archive, but we barely grabbed a handful of items before the servo skulls attacked. How could that possibly be enough to complete whatever you're building? Kalo's expression shifted to one of genuine amusement. Oh, Jex, you still think like a scavenger, counting individual pieces instead of seeing the larger pattern. We didn't need you to retrieve components, we needed you to activate the security systems. The realization hit him like a physical blow. The servo skulls weren't trying to stop us, they were scanning us. Biometric identification, genetic sampling, neural pattern recording, all the data we needed to complete our communication array's targeting algorithms. Kayla gestured to the altar, where displays now showed scrolling streams of data that included detailed biological information about both Jex and Senna. You see, our patrons are very particular about the quality of offerings they accept. Senna took a step backward, but cultists moved to block her path. You're insane. Whatever you think you're doing, the Adeptus Arbites will. The Arbites haven't been to the deep Underhive in 50 years, Marcus interrupted, his transformed arm flexing with movements that reminded Jex unpleasantly of a snake preparing to strike. Down here, we make our own law. The communication array began humming with increasing intensity, its jury-rigged components casting strange shadows that seemed to move independently of their sources. Kayla placed both hands on the altar's control surfaces, her mechanical fingers interfacing directly with systems that sparked and crackled with barely contained energy. The barriers between realms are weakening, she announced to the assembled cultists. Our faithful service has earned us the right to commune directly with our patrons, to receive their wisdom and their gifts. The humming became a roar that seemed to come from somewhere deeper than sound, vibrating through the stone floor and into Jex's bones. The symbols carved into the chamber floor began to glow with phosphorescent light that hurt to look at directly, and the air itself seemed to thicken as if reality was becoming more dense. The time for revelation is at hand, she continued, her voice somehow audible above the increasing chaos. Let our patrons witness the offering we bring, 2 souls untouched by corruption, perfect vessels for their divine attention. Jex felt the weight of his father's combat knife against his leg, the familiar grip worn smooth by decades of desperate hands. It wouldn't be enough against 40 cultists in an enclosed space, but it might be enough to ensure that whatever ritual Kayla had planned wouldn't go exactly as she had hoped. Sometimes in the Underhive, denying your enemy a perfect victory was the closest thing to triumph you could achieve. The communication array reached peak intensity, and something began to answer from the space between spaces, hungry and patient and utterly alien to human understanding. The response came not as sound, but as a presence that pressed against the inside of Jex's skull like a migraine made of pure malevolence. The air in the chamber began to shimmer with colors that had no names, and several of the newer cultists started bleeding from their eyes and ears as their minds struggled to process input they weren't equipped to handle. "Magnificent," Kayla breathed, her augmetic eye cycling through spectrum filters as she tried to focus on something that existed primarily in dimensions human perception couldn't access. They're listening. After 3 years of preparation, they're finally listening. The communication array's displays flickered with data streams that looked like corrupted code, mixed with anatomical diagrams and star charts showing regions of space that didn't match any Imperial records. Jex caught fragments, coordinates in the deep void, biological schematics for organisms that had never evolved naturally, and worst of all, population figures for Hive Tertius, broken down by Hab level and demographic categories. "You're not just trying to contact them," Senner realized, her voice barely audible above the array's otherworldly harmonics. "You're giving them targeting data." "Very perceptive." Marcus moved closer, his transformed arm extending tendrils that tasted the air around them like a predator sampling potential prey. "Our patrons require precise information to manifest their gifts effectively. They're remarkably efficient beings. Why waste energy corrupting random populations when you can focus on the most promising candidates?" The implications hit Jex like a bolt round to the chest. Hive Tertius housed 40 billion souls across 300 levels of urban sprawl. If even a fraction of them underwent the kind of transformation he was witnessing here, the entire sector would fall within weeks. And from there, the entire segmentum. "You're planning to turn the entire segmentum?" "Planning," Kayla laughed, the sound mixing with harmonics that seemed to come from somewhere else entirely. "Jex, we're not planning anything. We're simply facilitating an inevitable process. Humanity has spent 10,000 years worshipping a corpse emperor who offers nothing but suffering and stagnation. Our patrons offer evolution, transformation, and genuine power." The ritual circle's symbols were now blazing with light that cast no shadows, and the temperature in the chamber was rising despite the stone walls radiating cold. Several cultists had begun changing, their flesh flowing like wax as the proximity to their patron's attention triggered premature transformations. Jex watched in sick fascination as a former iron jackal sprouted additional arms from his torso, each one ending in fingers that split into fractal patterns of smaller digits. "The beautiful thing about corruption," Marcus continued, his voice now coming from multiple throats as his body reconfigured itself, "is that it spreads geometrically. Each transformed soul becomes a vector for further transformation. 1 becomes 10, 10 becomes 100, 100 becomes..." Jex's father had taught him that sometimes the only way to win was to change the rules of the game entirely. He palmed his combat knife and lunged not at the cultists, but at the communication array itself, driving the blade deep into the jury-rigged power coupling that connected the Imperial components to whatever unholy additions Kayla had made. The explosion knocked him backward 10 meters and probably saved his life. The array's feedback loop sent a pulse of corrupted energy through every connected system simultaneously, and the screams that followed came from both the cultists and from something much larger that existed in spaces between stars. Emergency lighting kicked in as the main power grid failed, bathing the chamber in the red glow of crisis illumination. Half the cultists were down, either unconscious or writhing in agony as their partial transformations reversed violently. The ritual circle's symbols flickered and dimmed, their connection to whatever had been listening severed by the array's destruction. "You have no idea what you've done," Kayla snarled, her mechanical arms sparking from feedback damage. "Do you think this was our only attempt? We have arrays in 7 different locations, each one capable of completing the ritual independently." "Maybe," Jex admitted, hauling Senna to her feet and checking her for injuries. "But this one's finished, and your patrons just learned that not everyone down here is willing to roll over and accept corruption." The surviving cultists were regrouping, but many of them were disoriented, and several were dealing with transformation reversals that looked extraordinarily painful. More importantly, the chamber's structural integrity had been compromised by the array's destruction. Cracks were spreading across the ceiling, and Jex could hear the ominous groaning of stone under stress. "The service tunnels," Senna gasped, pointing toward a partially concealed opening in the chamber's far wall. "I saw them on Grex's maps. They connect to the main arterial passages 3 levels up." They ran through chaos, dodging falling debris and cultists who were too busy dealing with their own problems to mount an effective pursuit. Behind them, Kayla's voice rose in what sounded like a prayer or a curse, calling on powers that might or might not still be listening now that their primary communication link had been severed. The service tunnels were a maze of maintenance shafts and power conduits that hadn't seen human traffic in decades. They crawled, climbed, and squeezed through passages barely wide enough for their bodies, following Senna's memorized maps and Jex's instinctive sense of direction toward anything that might represent safety. When they finally emerged into a familiar hab tunnel 4 hours later, both of them were bloodied, exhausted, and probably suffering from various forms of exposure poisoning. But they were alive, and more importantly, they had information that the right people needed to hear. "The Adeptus Arbites," Senna said, collapsing against a rusted wall. "We have to contact the Arbites and tell them what we found." Jex nodded, but part of him wondered if it would be enough. 40 billion souls in Hive Tertius, 7 corruption sites according to Kayla, and Emperor knows how many other gangs that had been quietly recruited into the growing cult. The Underhive had always been hell, but now it was hell with a purpose and a plan. Still, they'd struck a blow against something vast and terrible, and in the grim darkness of the far future, sometimes that had to be enough. The Adeptus Arbites response came at dawn. 12 squads of heavily armed enforcers descending into the deep tunnels with flamers, melt-a-bombs, and the kind of righteous fury that only true believers could muster. By the time the smoke cleared, they'd purged 4 active cult sites and eliminated over 200 corrupted gangers. But 3 sites remained unlocated, and Kalavex's body was never found among the charred remains. Jex stood in the upper hab levels for the first time in 3 years, watching dawnlight filter through the Hive's atmospheric processors. The air up here was cleaner, processed through systems that actually worked, and he could almost taste the difference. Senna stood beside him, her broken nose healing badly, but her eyes clear of the haunted look they'd carried since the ritual chamber. "The Arbites offered us residence permits for the mid-levels," she said, holding up official documents that represented salvation for someone born to the Underhive. Clean water, guaranteed food rations, even work assignments that don't involve crawling through toxic waste. "And all we have to do is never speak about what we saw down there?" Jex replied, fingering his own set of papers. The Arbites had been very specific about the terms of their relocation. Grateful silence in exchange for lives worth living. But silence had a price beyond the bureaucratic. Down in the tunnels, new gangers were already moving into territories abandoned by the purged cults. Young scavengers who'd heard whispers of easy power and transformation, who saw the Emperor's Imperium as just another gang with better weapons and worse promises. The corruption hadn't been eliminated. It had been driven deeper, made more careful, taught to hide better. "You think they'll try again?" Senna asked. Jex thought about Kayla's final words, about 7 communication arrays and patrons who existed in spaces between stars. I think they never stopped trying. We just made them work harder. The morning shift change was beginning, and millions of workers streamed through the hab levels toward factories and processing plants that would consume their lives one day at a time. Most of them had never been below the 100th level, never seen the tunnels where humanity's dregs fought for scraps and meaning. They lived and died without ever knowing how close they'd come to something that would have made their worst nightmares seem like pleasant dreams. "The thing about hell," Jex said finally, "is that it's not the flames that get you. It's the moment you start thinking the flames are normal." He'd spent 19 years in the Underhive and survived experiences that should have killed him a dozen times over. But standing here in the clean light of the upper levels, watching people go about their ordinary lives, he realized that the real horror wasn't the corruption they'd fought against. It was how easily it could spread if people forgot to keep fighting. Somewhere below, in tunnels that went deeper than any map could show, new voices were probably already starting to whisper about patrons who offered more than the Emperor ever could. New gangers were learning that survival wasn't enough, that there were powers willing to offer transformation and purpose to anyone desperate enough to listen. The Underhive had always been hell, but now Jex understood that hell wasn't a place, it was a choice, made one soul at a time, by people who decided that anything was better than the lives they'd been given. In the grim darkness of the far future, there are 10,000 ways to die, and only one way to truly live, by refusing to stop fighting, even when the fight seems hopeless, especially then. The Emperor's light burns eternal, but only because ordinary people choose to keep it burning, one small flame at a time, in the darkest places where hope should have died long ago. Some battles are never truly won, they're just fought again tomorrow by whoever has the courage to pick up the weapons that yesterday's heroes were forced to lay down. In the Underhive, that has to be enough.